Hi, everyone. My name's Martha. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Center for Career Development, and today's workshop is preparing for your interview. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start our workshop off with just a orientation to career development as a process where there are steps. So you can find this on our homepage, www.bu.edu/careers. And as you can see, the preparing for your interview is actually at the very end of the steps. So there's a few things we want you to consider and think about in order to move yourself along and do a successful interview. And we'll talk that through a little bit. So the first thing we're going to talk through is the idea of knowing yourself and looking at the match between what you bring, what your background is, what your skills, interests, values, personality, education, experiential pieces. What is it that you have in your background that's going to be related and valuable to the company that you're applying to? So we want you to make sure that you dissect that job description, pull it apart, look at it in terms of what is it that they feel is important, what are they asking for, and what kinds of specifics do you bring. You want to research the company by going to the company's homepage, website, making sure you look at their mission, make sure you look at their About Us, their staff, any other information that's useful to you. And also always be looking at what makes you unique, because we're all unique in terms of what we bring. So we want you to always be thinking about what are the aspects of your background that would help this employer understand why you're a good candidate. And there are additional sites that you can do research on, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, and CareerShift, which is located inside of the Handshake system. When you do your research on the organization, here are a few things that you can look at and think about. So the first thing is why this organization? What is their product or service? What is it that you feel is valuable and or interesting? How long have they been in business? What's their history? And in addition, what's their reputation like? You always want to be considering how that fits in with what you feel is important. What kinds of new developments are they involved in? What's their new initiatives? In addition, we want you to do research on what the salary range is so that you have a sense of that going into the interview. There's some great sites out there that will help. Salary.com, Glassdoor.com, Payscale.com, those are a few. We also want you to consider the competition, because that's good for you to know, and just in terms of your decision making, but also they may want to hear how well do you know the industry or the field. And then in addition to that, what's the organizational structure like? Is it more of a hierarchical structure, or is it more project-based? That may make a difference in terms of how they operate and how that fits in for you. And then what are the opportunities for development within the career? So looking at what opportunities for promotion and maybe what they're offering as far as in-house professional development. And then in addition to that, think about what the culture is like. So every company has their own sort of culture or style, and you want to sort of consider that in relation to what you think is important, as well as the dress. So, you know, certain companies would require a certain type of dress. We also want you to prepare yourself. So some of these are some things to consider when doing that. Why do you want this position as opposed to any other position? The more you can clarify that, the more you can name what you've learned. I think that's what the employers are wanting to hear and know. You've done your research and you really have a sense of that. What's the relevance of your education, experience, and your skill sets? Always be kind of looking at it from those different angles. And then there might be some questions on your career goals, both in terms of what's more immediate What are you going to be doing in the next year or 2 years? And then more long-term, maybe 5 years or 10 years out. So you want to give them a sense of, I've given this a decent amount of reflection and thought, and I have a sense of how that could play out. Then in addition to that, you want to be looking at your strengths. We all have strengths, so it's good to have a sense of what you want to name in relation to what you're going to do in the role. And then what are your weaknesses, which might be things that you would name that are things you're improving upon. Combination of strengths and weaknesses usually comes up in an interview. And then what questions would you want to be asking of the person that you're meeting with? So the goal of the interview is to determine a candidate's interest. And so we want you to be looking at it from these 3 areas. If you can sort of think of these as 3 overarching areas, pretty much you'll be prepared for any question that might come up. So the first one is fairly obvious. Can you do the job? Do you have the background, the skills, the knowledge? And good to have examples to support that. Personality, are you a good fit? Do you fit into the company culture? What do you have in your background that shows your personality traits and strengths? And then what is it that inspires you? And that a lot of times can play out in terms of the mission for the organization. So think about what it is that is motivating. And then there are different types of interviews that you may run into. So the traditional interview we'll talk about in a little more detail. It's the type of interview most people think of when they think about interviewing. The phone or screening interview is usually going to happen. Very first interview, usually about 20 to 30 minutes. They're going to ask a certain set of questions to see if you sort of fit into what they're looking for. And then the group interview is usually when the company is interviewing multiple people simultaneously at once. And so they may be wanting to see how you interact in a group. They may want to see whether or not you stand out as a candidate. If you're kind of using your active listening. So a lot of things could be happening in a group interview. And then a virtual interview, which is we're going to cover in a little bit more detail in a minute, but you want to be prepared and try to be as engaging as you possibly can, even if you're doing it virtually. So we do offer some resources and tools to help you with practicing your interview, because practicing is really key. So the first one I'm going to mention is Big Interview, and you can find Big Interview inside of the Handshake system under the Resource tab. And it's a combination of a audio and visual recording. There's an avatar that pops up and asks the interview question. You get to select what the question is, and then you just get to practice it. If you don't like how it's coming out, you can delete it and start again. So I think the value is fine-tuning what you might say in response to questions. In addition to that, we do offer mock interviewing in our office. You can sign up for a mock interview appointment through the Handshake system, meet with one of us, and we would be happy to walk you through that. And then the other piece that we want to mention is that you want to be prepared if it's going to be virtual, that you know the system that you're working with. So if you haven't used it yet, if it's Zoom or Skype or any other platform, go in and just play around a little bit, get familiar with the technical aspects so that you don't have to worry about it the day of. So again, if it's a virtual interview, these are some things to consider. You want to make sure that the background that you're using is not going to be too wild, I guess. So neutral background, make sure that you've got a professional outfit on so that they see you as a professional. It also sort of sets the stage for you, and you can feel like you're in your professional attire. Lighting, whether or not it's, make sure there's good lighting. Make sure that you're in a room where you won't be interrupted and there's no noises, distracting noises. You can use headphones if you choose to, but again, make sure that you have the right set when you're doing your interview. And when you do a virtual interview, the closest you can get to a in-person is to look at the camera. So that's a good strategy. And also think about what you're doing with your name. I know sometimes people like to use more social names that they would use with friends, so just make sure that your username is what you want it to be. And when you're preparing your marketing materials, your resume, we do have a system that you can tap into called VMock. If you go to our homepage, you'll see you can type the word VMock in and it'll bring up where you can access that. It's a AI system that goes through and it actually scores your resume, gives you a score that tells you where you're at with that, and also color-coded feedback so you can see combination of the content, the consistency, the layout, the design, and then it gives you up to 6 edits per year to go in and work on that. So VMock is a great way to get started. We also offer resume reviews throughout the semester, and you can access that through Handshake as well. Cover letters, same situation. You can have a cover letter draft and meet with one of us and we can go through that with you, and that's available to you through Handshake. Your LinkedIn profile and or other social media accounts. Bottom line is this is your branding, your professional branding. So you always just want to make sure that you have a profile that is showing what your areas of focus and interest are, and we do offer appointments to go over LinkedIn profiles and social media accounts. And then lastly, your portfolio. This is a chance for you to show an actual example of what your work is. And so it might be an e-portfolio or it might be an actual tangible portfolio. And it might be a website, but basically this is a place where you're going to start to store examples of what you're bringing to the work situation. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of dress for success. So again, the first step is to do your research on the company and really try to tune into how they're presenting themselves. What's their culture? What are you picking up in terms of maybe they have visuals, they have pictures, or maybe they're describing it for you. And then think about either business formal or business casual. Usually, if you're interviewing, you're going to go with business formal. And that means that you would have a professional outfit, which might be like a button-down shirt with a blazer, or you might have a dress, but it would be basically you know, paired up with a nice cardigan, that kind of thing. And you also want to make sure that you're choosing neutral colors and simple patterns. And if it's business casual, then maybe you would want to have it be like khakis and a polo shirt, or something that's a little bit more informal. Maybe you would have chinos, but again, I think I would go with something that's more of like a blue or black or a brown, something like that. You also want to be aware of your overall presentation. Pay attention to how your hair is looking that day. Make sure that you're outwardly oriented, so you're smiling, and pay attention to your nonverbal communication. I know sometimes people will get a little nervous when they're interviewing, and so if you have any nervous habits, just be aware of that. And lastly, we have a professional clothing closet that you can access and get an appointment, come in and maybe do some looking at professional clothes. You can do that through the Handshake system. So now we're talking about the stages of the interview. And there are a great interview is actually, you wouldn't be aware of the stages, but we like to break it out for you so that you can kind of think of it in these terms. So the first stage is when you're first meeting the person, usually termed an ice breaking. And this is important because this is the first time they're meeting you and they're making a first impression. So if they're asking you a question such as, did you have any trouble finding us? Or I see on your resume that you like ice hockey, or something to that effect. It's not a yes, no answer. You want to engage. You want to sort of show that you're interested in having a conversation, and that you're ready to go. The bulk of the interview will be the employer asking you questions, and we will dive into that in a minute in terms of how to break that out. And then they'll usually be asking you at the end, towards the end, do you have any questions for us? And you should always have questions. So I usually tell people to have at least 3 in your back pocket, and you can come in with some ideas of questions, and we'll talk that through a little bit. But you can also be jotting notes down maybe while you're having your interview, and maybe thinking of what are some follow-up questions, things you would like to hear more about. And then stage 4 is the closing of the interview, which is when, if you are really interested and excited with what you've learned, this is your time to let them know. And also make sure that you get contact information, so you know who to send your thank you notes out to. And if it's a group interview where you're meeting with more than one employer, then you want to make sure you know everybody's name and title. And you also want to make sure you know what your next steps in the process are and their timeline. Okay, so here are some samples of types of questions. There are traditional questions such as, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Again, we mentioned that. There might be a case interview question where they want to hear not just the answer, but also how do you get to it? What's your process like? So an example of that is, why are manhole covers round? An open-ended question, tell me about yourself, very, very popular question, and usually is the very beginning of the interview. Chance for you to maybe tell them specifics of what you feel they need to pay attention to, maybe a brief summary of what it is that you feel makes you unique, and what you bring to the position. Factual questions basically are about testing your specific knowledge in a particular area. So it might be like a technical question. Situational behavioral questions, they're basically wanting to hear an example of how you've behaved in the past, because the feeling is that that would give them an indication of how you're going to perform in the future. So an example of that is, tell me about a time when you worked with a colleague who was difficult, and how did you handle it? And so in that instance, maybe they want to hear a little bit about your conflict resolution skills, and you can give them an example of something that shows that. And we're going to walk through that, give you a strategy and how to approach that. And then, as we mentioned before, career goal questions. So where do you see yourself in 5 years? With that, again, what they're wanting to hear is that you've given it some thought, and you do have a sense of where you envision your career going. So this is a way for you to structure your answers when you're, especially with a behavioral question. It's referred to as the STAR technique, where S is standing for situation, T is for task, A is for action, and R is for result. So I'm going to show you an example. So tell me about a time when you had to complete a task under a tight deadline. How did you handle it? So this person is starting with the situation or task, typically plan my workout stages and complete it piece by piece. And then they move it into what they were asked to do. They were asked to handle a big project, which was under deadline, and they only had a few days to do it. So then the action, I created a task force, I delegated the work, and this is the result. We all completed the assignment with a day to spare. And sort of ending it with, I think I thrive under tight deadlines. So this gives the recruiter a chance to hear very specifically what you bring. And I think it's a great strategy if you're trying to get into more specifics of what were you involved in. And here are some sample questions for when they ask you, do you have any questions for us? Certainly you can create your own. Again, I think it's good to have 3 to 5 to show that you are interested. And again, you can always choose questions based on what you have talked with the employer. But basically, it's good to have those questions. So maybe what's your management style? What's the work culture like? Is there opportunity for professional growth, professional development? And how's the work going to be evaluated? And then the closing, you just want to restate that you have an interest. If that's the case, make sure that they know that. Make sure that you know what the follow-up actions are and what their time frame is. Make sure that you send thank you notes out, and make sure you have your contact information so that you know the person's name and title and where to send the information. When you send your thank you note out, you can highlight what you feel went well in the interview, what the strong matches were, and just again restate that you're really excited and interested, and thank you for your time. And here's our contact information, which includes our website, www.bu.edu/careers, some of our social media platforms, and be sure to check out the BU blog as well.